What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with an emergency mini pod segment thing because the Wizards, the most popular franchise in the NBA, that's going to drive a ton of traffic to this podcast and YouTube channel, got rid of, demoted, they really fired Wes Unseld Jr. And I didn't want to put this, we have a very big episode. It's like 80 minutes long. I talked about the Toronto Raptors direction with Samson Folk going up on Friday, and I didn't really feel like attaching Wizards talk to that. It was a little bit too random whether you put it at the beginning or the end. So the Wizards get rid of Wes Unseld Jr. Everyone could kind of see this coming from the moment that the Wizards changed their front office regime, having Michael Winger, having Will Dawkins in charge. The timing here, though, is interesting. And they did, and I think it was more a show of he has connections to the franchise, and you don't really ever want to have a lame duck coach in the NBA, even though that's essentially what he was because of the front office regime change. They picked up his team option. And so it's just whatever. The coaches don't count against a salary cap. And he was not one of the higher paid coaches in the league anyway, whether it was a solid because of his connections to the organization, whether it's because they actually wanted to make sure that players respected him, didn't view him as a lame duck coach, combination of the two. He's now moving into a front office role, which is just, that could be a no-show type of role. He does have, again, connections to the organization, so maybe it won't be. The timing is interesting, and I think it boils down to one reason why. It's not necessarily the overarching product, although the Wizards are pretty bad. I think that he specifically, and the team in general, is failing the development of Bilal Coulibaly. And anyone who's listened to this channel, this podcast before, read any of my work over at Bleacher Report, knows, I think, the world of Bilal Coulibaly as a prospect. And he has, he's slumping over the past month or so, but he's having a pretty good year. He is a lot more polished than people expected coming out of the NBA draft. The 3-point shooting, again, down now, and it can be a little slow, but he was hitting them. He is a terror in transition. He has the ability to attack some of the open spaces with the ball in his hands, to get rid of the ball and make decisions when he's moving downhill with some live dribble stuff. That ability is all there, in addition to shouldering this incredible defensive workload where he's essentially just on the opposition's best player a ton of the time. And to do that as a rookie for basically 25, 26, 27 minutes a game, that's a big deal. And in that aspect, Wes Unseld being willing to throw him, I mean, not that you have all these other great options, but Wes Unseld Jr. being able to throw him on the opposition's best player or experimenting with that deserves some credit there. And even some of the ways that the Wizards used him in transition. However, you start to look at it, and just on the season, his usage rate is so incredibly low. He is basically just near the bottom of the barrel I think he's 8th in touches per game for this team. And that's actually been down. His touches have been down since the start of January. We've seen him get very little agency to explore his own creation on the offensive end. I mean, this is someone whose usage rate on the year is incredibly low. And since January, the only rotation player on the Wizards since the start of January to have a lower usage rate than Bilal Coulibaly is Daniel Gafford. And so you have a lower usage rate than DeLon Wright, who just doesn't even want to finish plays other than with a pass, which isn't factored into usage rate. There are some total usage stats out there. Usage rates just taking into account possessions that end in free throws, turnovers, or shot attempts. And DeLon Wright doesn't want to shoot. DeLon Wright doesn't want to score. So to be behind him is just wild. But to be behind guys like a Corey Kispert, yeah, one thing, Jordan Poole, Kyle Kuzma, but to be behind Marvin Bagley, since he's come over, and to see him get more featured, to have more touches per game in the front court, no less, than Bilal Coulibaly, that is a failure. And I recognize that Bilal Coulibaly could be hitting a rookie wall. We're more than halfway through the season. He wasn't necessarily playing a ton for the Metropolitan 99, I think, what are they called? But he was with Victor Wembanyama last year, so he wasn't playing a ton. You're dealing with more games, more minutes. Again, your defensive workload has just verged on insanity for a rookie, I would say. So I get that element, and that could account for some of the efficiency drop off. And the way that the Wizards have played, it's really benefited Denny Avdia this year. Tyus Jones has had some really good stretches. Jordan Poole's largely played like dog shit. Kyle Kuzma, I still tend to be higher on Kyle Kuzma's play, both on offense and defense, than the consensus. I don't know when that happened, because I was probably lower than the consensus while he was on the Lakers. But for the past 2 years, while he's been in Washington, and even kind of the end of his Lakers tenure, I've just been a little bit higher on him. And so, yes, there are bright spots individually on this team. And you could point to other flaws for the Wizards as to why you would make this decision. And that's they don't have guiding principles. They've been, I think that, look, the defense looks really bad at certain points, and the effort can be terrible on certain plays. They've done a little bit of a better job of like kind of getting at the low hanging fruit. They're not fouling a ton. They don't give up a ton of wide open jumpers relative to the rest of the league. Now, part of that is going to be because they can just get attacked, and there's very little resistance outside of Denny Avdia, Bilal Coulibaly, Kyle Kuzma at certain stints. You have DeLon Wright, and I do think individually they have some guys, whether it's Daniel Gafford, even Tyus Jones at some points. Everyone relax. I understand what Tyus Jones is on defense, where they can provide some resistance straight up one-on-one. And the Wizards have actually been one of the better isolation defenses in the league this year on those possessions. And I do think that matches with the eye test, by the way. But when you start to throw wrinkles into the equations and you've got guys moving off the ball, or even more basically, they just don't know how to defend when screening action is involved, or they could die on screens, or they're getting lost. There's miscommunications on whether are they trying to trap, are they trying to hedge, are they stunting, what are they doing? And you can just tell in those moments. There's only one team in the league that is worse at defending off screens right now than Washington. And I think it's either Portland or it's San Antonio, or it's just one of the bottom feeding teams. And so to be in that position, to not have more discipline on the defensive end, to go through moments where their transition defense could be worse, but there's also just stretches where it feels like guys aren't getting back or don't care to get back. And then you just don't have this guiding principle in general, where it's what do the Wizards do? They play fast and chaotic because they're at a talent deficit. And that's what you do when you're at a talent deficit, is you play fast, you play chaotic. And yeah, there can be some entertainment value in that, and it can work like for certain stints, but it's not going to be conducive to the most efficient offense. And so you look at the Wizards right now, offensively, I don't think you could even say, aside from speed, what's their guiding principle. And they're not even, I mean, they're top 4 in average offensive possession time. So they're playing really fast, and they're 5th in average possession time after a made shot. So the fact that speed is your guiding principle, okay, cool. And that you're going to run after every defensive rebound, where the only team playing faster after defensive rebounds is the Spurs, another team at a conventional half-court talent deficit. No one plays faster after forcing turnovers than the Wizards, and they're actually averaging 1.4 points per possession after a turnover. That is second in the league. That's a big freaking deal. But when you're going to look at this team, well, they're not really forcing turnovers in droves. They're about league average there or worse in that department. And so that is not even part of their identity. Like I said, they don't foul a lot. They don't give up a ton of wide open looks. I do think a lot of that has to do with just the overall resistance when you're going to have guys moving off the ball, being able to get downhill. So getting away from jumpers and being able to get to the rim, which, by the way, teams have done against the Wizards, it feels like, since the dawn of time. This really just, it predates. It's an issue that predates Wes Unseld Jr., of course. But this year specifically, like, yes, you've been able to, in the previous 3 seasons, I think the Wizards were very good at not limiting opponent shots at the rim. And this year, they're just 25th in opponent rim attempt frequency. That's what I know. And then the resistance I was referring to, the Wizards have been basically like bottom 5 in raw opponent percentage at the rim for, it feels like the dawn of time. They've been pretty bad there. And so the lack of guiding principles factors into it. But even amid some of the bright spots, you are failing the most important player in the organization in Bilal Coulibaly by not testing the depths of his offense more. It can be ugly. And I have been a big proponent of, well, you want to streamline the roles of this. So him being in more of a, toned down role, it can benefit him if you have other guys you're evaluating for the long term. And we know Kyle Kuzma is not going to be part of the bigger picture here. We know Jordan Poole, they probably don't want him to be part of the bigger picture, even though they might be stuck with him for a couple seasons. Tyus Jones will probably be traded. DeLon Wright will probably be traded. There's Denny Avdia, and even he might be traded just because there are so many teams that are going to be interested in him, and it's easier to move guys while they're on the poison pill provision now than ever if you're dealing with a non-tax team. Even for tax teams, like, there's workarounds for it, especially when you're dealing with a salary that's as modest as his, both now and when his extension kicks in, and that's when you factor in base year compensation. So I understand the idea of, well, we want to play in a way where we don't want Bilal to be baptized by fire at both ends. He's being baptized by fire on defense. I get that. But like, when you have a lack of long-term coherence in general, we'll find out more about this player, especially because he's ahead of the curve. There's no reason, just as an example, 1 pick and roll possession as the ball handler per game for Bilal Coulibaly, and that's been down since the start of January. one possession. That should be at least doubled or tripled to where just 3 possessions just to see what happens so he gets a feel for live dribble playmaking, for what to do in kind of the in-between zones against how defenses are going to cover him. Can he work on the pull-up jumper at all? There hasn't been enough of that. And so I believe that's the primary reason Wes Unseld Jr. was fired. And then there's reassigned. I'm sorry. The other thing to note here, though, is the timing is still interesting because, well, most people probably expect that Bilal Coulibaly's role will increase in prominence after the trade deadline, when I would bet, between Tyus Jones, Denny Avdia, DeLon Wright, Kyle Kuzma, and Jordan Poole, he's not going to get traded. I'd be shocked if he did. But like between that group, probably 2 of those guys are getting traded. So there should be more touches to go around. Maybe you start to see shenanigans where Jordan Poole and Kuzma aren't playing as much down the stretch of the year, not because they're hurting your tank. We know Jordan Poole is not, but because you want to get some of these other guys touches. I think the bigger thing here is, well, Brian Keefe, he has ties to Will Dawkins and Michael Winger from their days in Oklahoma City together. And the relationship between the 3 of them has been described as, I think Josh Robbins of the Athletic said, strong. And that matters. The other thing is you make the move because you want Brian Keefe to be a candidate. You might be interested in him to be the permanent head coach. I'm not saying they shouldn't hold an extensive search after the season. All the reporting states that they will, in fact, hold a comprehensive search, as they should. We'll see who's available. I think Kenny Atkins is a name to keep an eye on. They might be in the mix for like a David Vanderpool. They probably will, I think, gravitate towards someone who doesn't have a ton of head coaching experience or any head coaching experience at all. But Brian Keefe, if you're looking at this guy, you're saying, well, we want to see what he can do because we believe he might actually be a viable head coaching prospect. And I won't say this is an excuse for not holding an extensive search once the season's over. And there could just be other guys that lose their job around the league that all of a sudden become very interesting for this team. I can't think of necessarily one off the top of my head. This is not, Adrian Griffin, or if Chauncey Billups gets fired in Portland. And then, if Steve Kerr, his contract is up in Golden State, he's not going to go to Washington. If Greg Popovich leaves the Spurs, he's going to retire. And so like, you're looking at some of these other options. I don't know, Billy Donovan gets bounced. I mean, he signed the secret extension. That's not someone that you're going to want in Washington, but I'm just saying there could be other candidates that become available that really interest them. I think it's more so that they believe in Brian Keefe. And so the team wasn't good. They've probably underachieved, relative to the talent on the roster, just by not having guiding principles on the court. And then the Bilal Coulibaly stuff. That's the bigger one for me. And that's not to say I don't think the personnel was good enough for Wes Unseld Jr. to do a much better job. But if you're not connecting with the players, and if your biggest kind of developmental victory this season is, well, look at what Denny Avdia is doing, and it's because Denny Avdia just has this more prominent role, and it's, well, why didn't this happen sooner? You were in a position even before the Bradley Beal trade to do it because of all the injuries that you were slogging through. We'll have to see what this leads to. I wouldn't predict necessarily that Brian Keefe is still the head coach at the start of next season, but you make this move for 2 underlying reasons. 2. That's my firm belief here. It has nothing to do with, it has very little to do with expectations. It's the Bilal Coulibaly developmental arc should be on a more accelerated and aggressive trajectory than it is right now because he's better than expected. And then you're actually very much interested in Brian Keefe being the guy moving forward. Those are my thoughts. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe to this podcast wherever you get it. Hit the sub button on YouTube, like the video, comment, help the algorithm love us back. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And I can't reiterate, whether you're using them or not, subscribe and leave us 5-star ratings as well as reviews, specifically on Apple. That can help us in the charts and continue to build up this show and continue to just make this show free. Grant and I do cover the NBA full-time for a living with Bleacher Report. That enables us to use this as just sort of a passion project where we don't care about generating a crap ton of revenue. So we would like to build up this YouTube channel and this show as much as possible. If it's a matter of sharing our stuff, shouting us out on Twitter, telling people about us, we appreciate every recommendation or vote of endorsement that we get. Until next time, which will be on Friday with Samson Folk of Raptors Republic, I leave you with a shout out to the one, the only, the indelible, the legendary Frank Ntilikina.